I'm going to read a chapter from the great Civil War classic, I Rode with Stonewall. It's by Henry Kyd Douglas, who was on Stonewall Jackson's staff and thus was able to see Stonewall Jackson up close in much of the war. And this is considered to be one of the most helpful, interesting, readable portraits of Stonewall Jackson from during the war. I'm actually not going to read a chapter that focuses on Stonewall Jackson. Another time I'll do that. This chapter, called The Death of Ashby, is from rather early in the war. It's actually during the famous Valley Campaign. And Turner Ashby was a great cavalryman, general of cavalry. And he, he died heroically in this chapter, as is related in this chapter, but it's also just a lovely little picture of the Shenandoah Valley. And that's why, particularly, I think this might be of interest, both to get a sense of this amazing valley that I, too, am blessed to live in, and the sense of this rather remarkable man in its history. The little chapter begins and ends with excerpts from poems that were written in honor of General Ashby. Saw ye the veterans, hearts that have known never a quail of fear, never a groan, sob mid the fight they win, tears their stern eyes within. Ashby, our paladin, Ashby is gone. The sun from its rising to its setting does not shine upon a more blessed spot than the Valley of Virginia. From the beautiful bank of the River of Swans, the historic Potomac, to where the noble and solemn mountains of the old state send down their streamlets to form the Shenandoah and the James, are countless evidences of the generosity with which Providence has dealt with this royal region. The Blue Ridge on the east, the Alleghanies on the west, seem to enclose this favored valley in a magnificent frame. The odd Massanutten is thrown up in the midst of it, with peculiar effect, so that the rich and fertile garden may offer equal attractions to the artist and the agriculturist. From Jefferson's Rock at Harper's Ferry, to stand upon which said Thomas Jefferson was worth a trip across the Atlantic, to the natural bridge, the traveler may wander over picturesque mountains, by splendid rivers and clear rivulets, through stately groves and broad green fields, each richest of its kind and unsurpassed on all this great continent. But as it was beautiful and bountiful, it attracted destruction, for it was the great or chief storehouse of the Army of Virginia. If this valley is lost, Virginia is lost, said Jackson, and the Confederacy could not survive Virginia. A broad land that blossomed as the rose when the war began, it was a scene of deserted homesteads, smoldering ruins, wasted fields, shattered groves, and general desolation when General Philip Sheridan had done with it. Now that the war is over, it will in time rise again, but it will be difficult to convince the future historian that such wholesale destruction was not useless and barbarous. It was a lovely valley to do battle for, a decorated deathbed for the cavalier and hero, and here Turner Ashby died. The valley loved him and loves him yet. During the war, he had never left her for a single day. He had watched over her without ceasing. He had made memorable her hills and streams, and the people along the hills still weep for him, and the forests echo their lamentations. On the 5th of June, General Jackson passed through Harrisonburg with the advance of his column and turned eastward toward Port Republic and the Blue Ridge. On the 6th, headquarters were established at the hospitable residence of Mr. Kemper beyond Port Republic, a small village situated at the junction of the Middle Branch and South Branch as they flowed together and formed the South Fork of the Shenandoah River. The South Branch is fordable at any point. The Middle Branch, having been increased by the waters of the North Branch higher up the stream, is deep, and was spanned by an old but substantial bridge, across which ran the road from Port Republic to Harrisonburg. The troops were encamped on the north side of the Middle Branch, Jackson's old division just opposite Port Republic, and the division of General Ewell at Cross Keys, several miles nearer Harrisonburg. General Ashby, with a rear guard, was still at Harrisonburg. In the afternoon of the 6th, Fremont, that's General Fremont, who is a Federal general in pursuit at this point of Stonewall Jackson's army. In the afternoon of the 6th, Fremont closed in cautiously upon Harrisonburg and took possession, Ashby retiring. General Bayard, with his horse and infantry support, followed Ashby, his immediate advance being under Colonel Percy Wyndham, a soldier of fortune from over the sea who had entered the Federal service. Ashby retired, watchful and provokingly tenacious. Then Wyndham determined to attack with a charge and led it. His troops were not so belligerent. He made the charge very much alone, as he ascertained when his horse was shot under him, and he was a prisoner. He was captured by a cavalryman who was out in front of his command, Holmes Count Conrad of Winchester, afterwards Major and Assistant Adjutant General on the staff of Major General T.L. Rosser, and lately Solicitor General of the United States. In this little affair, Ashby took a number of prisoners and sent Colonel Wyndham to General Jackson's headquarters. I met Wyndham on the way and heard with amusement of the comical meeting between him and Major Bob Wheat of the Louisiana Tigers. Wheat was sitting on the fence when Wyndham passed by and recognized him. He yelled out his name and, springing into the road, greeted him with loud welcome as a prisoner. Wyndham was still an adventurer, caring little on what side he fought. But Wheat was fighting for a cause in which his whole soul was enlisted and for which he afterward gave up his life. I returned with Wyndham to headquarters. He was in a most resentful mood toward his own troops and repeated to me what he had said to Major Wheat, that they started in the charge with him and then deserted him in the most cowardly manner. He was not an attractive-looking warrior and looked like what he was, a soldier of fortune. Skirmishing continued after the capture of Wyndham, with no material results. As the sun was going down, Ashby, desirous of catching a party of the enemy who were in his front, ready to follow if he retired and retreat if he advanced, requested General Ewell to furnish him with several regiments of infantry. The 1st Maryland, Colonel Bradley T. Johnson, and Colonel John Letcher's Virginia Regiment were sent to him. Skirmishing soon began, and the Federals, having been reinforced with infantry, drove the Confederate skirmish line back upon its support. Just then Ashby had his horse shot under him, the same, by the way, upon which Jackson was wounded at Bull Run. Thus suddenly dismounted, he placed himself at the head of the Virginia regiment, which was wavering under the hot fire, and waving his sword in the air, moved forward and called upon them to follow him. At the same time, General Ewell rode up and ordered the 1st Maryland to charge. The order was handsomely obeyed, and in a few minutes the enemy was driven from the field. But Ashby was dead, shot through the heart. He never spoke, but calmly breathed his last in the arms of Lieutenant Jim Thompson, who loved him as only a fearless young soldier can love his hero, and whose love was fully rewarded by Ashby's love for him. Dear, impulsive, generous Thompson, who never afterwards mentioned Ashby's name without a sigh. He went too at the very last. He fell at the head of a regiment of cavalry leading a charge at High Bridge when the end of the war was in sight, and now sleeps near Ashby's side in the Stonewall Cemetery at Winchester. In this little fight, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas L. Kane of the Pennsylvania Bucktails and some of his battalion were captured, the colonel being wounded. In a conversation at the time with Captain James R. Herbert, who commanded the Maryland skirmishers, Colonel Kane of Pennsylvania said, Quote, I have today saved the life of one of the most gallant soldiers in either army, General Ashby, a man I admire as much as you do. His figure is familiar to me, for I have seen him often enough in our front. He was today within 50 yards of my skirmishers, sitting on his horse, unconscious of the danger he was in. I saw 3 of them raise their guns to fire, but I succeeded in stopping 2 of them and struck up the gun of the 3rd as it went off. Ashby is too brave to die in that way. Unknown to Colonel Kane, Ashby was dead, and he was pronouncing his first eulogy. Afterwards, Kane remarked to a gentleman who was writing on the war, "Deal justly with the memory of Ashby. He must have been a noble fellow, a brave soldier, and a gentleman." I saw Colonel Kane and met him once again after the war. I was at the legislature in Harrisburg, trying to get an appropriation to remove the Confederate dead from Gettysburg. He happened to be there, and in company with another admirable and generous soldier, General John F. Hartranft, then Auditor General of the state, offered to go with me before the proper committees of the Senate and House. They supported my application earnestly. Colonel Kane was so much impetuous feeling that he seemed to make it a matter of personal patriotism. He had not recovered from his wound, and that gave emphasis to his words. It gave me great pleasure to be able to tell him what Ashby's comrades thought of his eulogy at Cross Keys. General Jackson was sitting in his room in a private interview with Colonel Wyndham when a messenger arrived announcing the death of Ashby. Throughout headquarters, there was a gloomy shadow and almost voiceless grief. It was the first heavy personal loss that had befallen the Army of the Valley, and there was no useless attempt to give expression to it. Colonel Wyndham was at once dismissed, and the general locked the door of his room. What transpired there, how he wrestled with his sorrow, no one will ever know. If he found comfort in his grief at the sudden taking of his invaluable ally, he never spoke of it to anyone. The body of General Ashby was taken to Charlottesville by his assistant adjutant general, Captain Sturgis Davis, for burial. Uncontrollable was the grief of his troopers. A sad parting, as their knightly chief, covered by a military pall, was carried from their midst. He, the invincible, and as they had learned to believe, the invulnerable, was wounded and conquered and dead. His own place could not be and was never filled. Their captured foes, standing by as the hearse passed along the road, as if in sympathy for their bereavement and in respect for their great enemy, stood in respectful silence, and many of them with uncovered heads. General Ashby was a man of striking personal appearance, about 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a well-proportioned figure, graceful and compact, black eyes, black hair, and a flowing black beard. His complexion was of the darkest brunette, so dark that a Federal scout whom he once shot with a pistol declared he had been shot by a Negro. His face was placid, not stern. Even his smile was shadowed with a tinge of melancholy. Some who knew him well said it was because he had never recovered from the death of his brother, Richard, killed early in the war. His face did not flush in battle or under excitement. Only the melancholy passed away, and his countenance, alive, determined, was still calm. He often smiled, rarely laughed. His eye was gentle, peaceful. In battle it did not sparkle fitfully, but burned steadily beneath his dark brows. His was a face that any likeness of must be a caricature, the kind that cannot be photographed. Riding his black stallion, he looked like a knight of the olden time. Galloping over the field on his favorite war horse, his white one, eager, watchful, he was fascinating, inspiring. Altogether, he was the most picturesque horseman ever seen in the Shenandoah Valley. He seemed to have been left over by the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe. General Ashby, in his brief career of 1 year, had not the same opportunity to show what his ability as a cavalry officer was as to exhibit his personal attractiveness and strength of character. As a captain, he was without a peer. As a captain, he was without a superior, popular, exacting. As a colonel, with an independent command, he was active, vigilant, energetic, never at rest. It was said of him that he evidently had made a contract with President Davis to fight the Yankees every day for the term of 1 year from the 1st of January, 1862. If so, he kept his promise to the day of his death. Indeed, in one of his letters to his friend, Colonel A.R. Butler, he said he had made 38 fights in 28 days. The statements of Ashby with regard to the strength and position of the enemy were generally singularly accurate. Once at Kernstown, he was deceived. His idea of the superior patriotism of the volunteer, and that he should not be subjected to very much starch and drill, made him a poor disciplinarian and caused the only failures he ever made. It was believed that he was awakening to the necessity of better discipline among his cavalry, and that he would have made a better brigadier general than colonel. His service to the army was invaluable, but had he been as full of discipline as he was of leadership, his success would have been more fruitful, and his reputation still greater. Yet it should be remembered that he had little time for instruction of any kind. From the beginning, his only drill ground was the field of battle, and his daily conflicts and marches occupied all his time and thoughts. He was compelled to organize his troops while on the gallop. General Jackson thus spoke of him, quote, "An official report is not an appropriate place for more than a passing notice of the distinguished dead. But the close relations which General Ashby bore to my command for most of the previous 12 months will justify me in saying that as a partisan officer I never knew his superior. His daring was proverbial, his power of endurance almost incredible, his tone of character heroic, and his sagacity almost intuitive in divining the purposes and movements of the enemy." End quote. In October 1866, General Ashby's remains were removed from Charlottesville, and on the 25th of that month were buried in the Stonewall Cemetery at Winchester, with many services and ceremonies, in the presence of a great concourse of people. There they now rest in the Valley of Virginia, amid the proudest monuments of his glory. There, through the coming ages, when his sword is rust, and his deeds in classic pages, mindful of her trusts, shall Virginia, bending lowly, still a ceaseless vigil holy, keep above his dust. The Death of Ashby. I rode with Stonewall, Henry Kyd Douglas.